I attended church my whole life, but at one point, I began to question two things. Why did I feel like such an outsider at church? And two was, how did people hear God speak? I always felt very lonely and felt like I lacked value and worth when I came to church because I didn't have close relationships with people my age, and so I was very bitter towards church and the people in it. I soon began to despair whenever I had to come to church on Fridays and Sundays, and so I tried making excuses to not go. After a while, the hurt that I had received from church and from personal circumstances created a big, endless hole in me. I felt like the Samaritan woman at the well as I tried to fill this hole with all sorts of different things, whether it was through finding new friends, watching TV, getting good grades, or even just serving at church. Though these things found temporary relief, I fell into greater anguish and hopelessness at the hole that was getting bigger and bigger, despite my desperate efforts to fill it up. During this time, I remember pleading to God and asking why all this was happening to me. Why everyone else seemed to find making friendships so easily. Why I couldn't even have these normal things that everyone else seemed to have just fine. I desperately asked God for something, anything, just someone that would come with an embrace and love me for who I was, but I never heard an answer. As a child, I never really understood when people would say they heard God speaking to them. I had always thought that God physically talked to you or showed you a vision, but as several years went without an answer, I began to blame and resent God. It became so easy to fall and submerge myself into that dark hole, and as a result, I pushed God and everyone away from me. However, every time I tried to cut myself away from God, He would always find ways to bring me back to Him. Whether it was through missions and retreats, serving at church, or even through certain people, God made His presence known so evidently, and so I kept pleading to God and asking why I was going through all this, and when I would feel the embrace of love and of home. However, there was still no answer from God, and despite being so blessed, I felt dismayed by the lack of response from Him. But it was the winter retreat of my senior year when God had finally answered me, and He didn't answer me through physical words or through a vision, but He had answered me in a way only I could understand and comprehend. I was desperately praying the same prayer I had prayed since I was a child when I suddenly felt someone embrace me so deeply and pray over me. And all of a sudden, I just broke down. I cried and cried as the countless times I felt resentment, bitterness, and anguish had just melted away in an instant. It was through this embrace that God had answered me after all those years as He showed me that He was there, that He was love, and He was home. I felt like a captive being free from years of heavy bondage as I felt that heavy burden of bitterness lift from my shoulders. Even after this, God has continued to speak to me in ways that were so unique and personal to me, in ways that made me understand what an intimate relationship with God was. There have been times when I struggled after this event, when an internal voice that I knew was Satan asked me, "How do you even know that God is real?" But after experiencing God so personally, the answer was so simple. Because looking back at my 18, 19 years of life, God has been so undeniable. I've seen, felt, and experienced God's mark. And through the painful experiences I went through, I learned that sometimes God says yes, sometimes He says no, and sometimes He says wait. And it was during this waiting period that I grew and experienced God's love, grace, and mercy so richly. It was during this period that I began to reciprocate God's love to others and embrace them more deeply than I could have ever without this period. And I'm here to firmly say that for such an undeserving person like me, God has sent His beloved Son to die. And for such a sinful and dirty person like me, that God has allowed me to taste the freedom that comes from the one truth. And I can confidently say here that He was and is that truth that set me free. Thank you.